Reaver Lieutenants are unsurprisingly lieutenants, second in command to captains, that wear Reaver armor and specialize in the shock assault tactics of the Reavers. They are a rather recent development in Space Marines, and unfortunately, this video isn't going to be very positive, if you couldn't gather. So, I'm Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Reaver Lieutenant. So, the Reaver Lieutenant comes in at 55 points for himself. His stat line is pretty standard: 6 inches of movement, toughness 4, 3+ save, 4 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 1. A solid enough character stat line for 55 points, but where things really start to fall apart is our weapons. So, in one of the longest weapon names in the game, we have the Master-Crafted Special Issue Bolt Pistol, which is precise, with 1 attack, that hits on 2s at 12-inch range with Strength 4, AP 1, and Damage 2. Then, the Combat Blades are in melee, which are precision, 6 attacks, hit on 2s at Strength 4, AP 0, and Damage 1. While the pistol is a fine enough pistol profile, his melee profile is quite bad, and also really isn't super adept at taking buffs. Its precision isn't a super useful rule, which is unfortunate. And then his abilities, he only has Scout 6 inches, and of course Leader. Then in abilities, he has Tactical Precision while leading a unit. Weapons in that unit gain lethal hits, which is a solid enough buff. Then Terror Master, expanding the Terror Troops aura of Reavers by 3 inches when he is leading them. So, as a overall review of his stats, we have a very okay pistol. I'm not going to call his pistol bad, because I don't think it is, but a character's pistol is usually not why you buy them. Their melee is extremely weak, and unlike the, say, Phobos Lieutenant, it doesn't have a good special rule, where Sustained Hits 1 is generally useful, Precision is niche, and actually can be accessed for just a command point by any other character, making this guy a very poor character assassin, not even to mention its innate lack of AP, meaning it will struggle to kill anything with a 3+ save or higher, so other Space Marines or things of that nature. The lethal hits is a solid enough buff, but at this price point you could just get a Phobos Lieutenant who also has a better special rule. And then, as I mentioned, his stats are actually fairly okay in terms of raw stat lines, just his weapons really let him down, as well as his special abilities. So the Reavers are the only thing he can lead, and surprisingly, where you think this guy would be, right at home with the Reavers and would make them significantly better, it's actually quite the opposite. So Reavers as a datasheet are quite weak on their own, and the only reason that something like a Phobos Lieutenant makes them usable is because of their Deep Strike shenanigans they can do with moving after coming out of Deep Strike, which is a fun enough strat as it is. However, this guy, despite being a Reaver, cannot take a Grav Shoot, which means he doesn't have Deep Strike, so they're forced to deploy on the board and use their Scout move. Now, needless to say, this is a huge detriment to the Reavers, whose best attribute is undeniably having cheap Deep Strike. His damage is also very bad, and the lethal hits doesn't do much to buff that, and unlike the Lieutenant, his special rule on his main weapon is of course quite weak. Precision, as I mentioned, is niche and can be accessed by any character for 1 CP. As I mentioned, his damage doesn't help, and is poorer than the Phobos Lieutenant. And circling back to that Phobos Lieutenant, he is better in every single way. He doesn't restrict the Reavers, as he has Deep Strike, Scouts, and Infiltrators, so you can deploy them in any way you want. His main benefit is, of course, that Deep Strike, which then allows him to shoot and move, because his secondary rule is actually good. I didn't mention it much, but this guy's special rule is god-awful. The reason I say that is because Terror Troops, the aura that these Reavers have, is already quite niche. The -1 to leadership is a okay enough debuff, and they do force tests semi-frequently, but that doesn't really change that much because the Reavers want to be in melee anyways, which means that just having a little bit of extra range isn't as impactful as actually getting into melee, which the Phobos Lieutenant lets them do much better anyways. We're going to quickly run through the Core Codex Space Marine detachments. The Gladius detachment is, of course, the Take-All-Comers. There's no unit that's specifically bad in Gladius, but this guy is not worth the points on enhancements or stratagems, because he doesn't have any help for delivering his main unit, though I guess Advance and Charge is not the worst thing, as they will need to be foot slogging. Not that they would do much when they get there, these guys really need to pick their targets properly, and foot slogging melee units generally don't have that choice. The Anvil detachment is pretty pointless. They have a Feel No Pain enhancement when you're on an objective, which is good, but since this guy can't Deep Strike, there's really no benefit for it, as the Reaver's main use is to Deep Strike and steal a backfield objective. And then Iron Storm he's not great either. He's again very slow, no Deep Strike, which means he isn't much use as a grunt, and of course the Reavers themselves aren't objective-grabbing experts, so in general they do very little there as well, and are again outclassed by the Phobos Lieutenant. Firestorm, pretty much the same thing. His pistol is a bit better at close range, which is a fine enough buff. It makes it basically a heavy bolter, but he is again outperformed by that old pal, the Phobos Lieutenant, and not even mentioning other better characters. Stormlance has that +1 to wound and reroll charges. The strength enhancement could be useful, but again, as I mentioned, it's going to be better on the Phobos Lieutenant, who can deep strike and then steal the backfield objective. In Stormlance specifically, he gets that extra +1 to wound, which is very useful with sustained hits, as I've mentioned. And Vanguard, again, Vanguard surprisingly doesn't have that much to help these guys, and his damage is very bad, and again, no deep strike. First Company Task Force, he can do the Mortal Wound Bomb thing, which is okay, but once again, I'd say better on the Phobos Lieutenant, as the Phobos Lieutenant can deep strike anywhere on the field, meaning he can snipe out more fragile things much easier. So, if you didn't get the theme of this video, the Phobos Lieutenant, Reaver Lieutenant is probably the worst data sheet in all of Codex Space Marines. I can think of at least niche uses for almost everything else except this guy, excluding, like, Titans and stuff, because that's not... I'm talking the core game. I think he's in contention for the worst data sheet in the game. He actively hurts his unit by leading it, as they can't use their deep strike. He doesn't really... He doesn't actually, like, do anything. Lethal hits is a fine buff, but it's not even exclusive to him. The Phobos Lieutenant can bring it, and he is much better than him. Sustained and lethal is a much better combo than precise and lethal. If this guy was maybe 35 points, sure, bring him along. Then you'd actually have a pretty tough character for the cost. But at 55 points, just bring a Phobos Lieutenant who is better in every measurable way and doesn't have the restriction of no deep strike. It's just baffling how bad this guy is and why he doesn't have access to a grav shoot when he is a Reaver. That's like the Reaver's whole thing, the grapnel launchers and the grav shoots, so they can deploy in any position and traverse quickly. This guy is slow as tar because he can't do that. If you do want to run his model, which I'll admit, he's got a pretty nice model. I like it. I like the smoke screen. He's got a cool looking pistol. And the pose is very strong, I think. If you want to run him, just run him as a Phobos Lieutenant. I see zero reason to ever bring the Reaver Lieutenant. It really is... It's honestly baffling how bad this guy is. Like, as I mentioned, I don't think he's just the worst in the Space Marine Codex. I think he's one of the worst data sheets in the game. Anyways, this has been a rather negative video. I've been spoons rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what you think of this guy. And I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye. Phobos Librarians are unsurprisingly librarians that wear Phobos armor, specializing in vanguard tactics and often using magic more so to hide themselves and their troops, more so than using them to explode the brains of their enemies. They also have probably the single coolest librarian model ever, in my opinion. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Phobos Librarian of the Space Marines. So, the Phobos Librarian is of course a character unit for the Space Marines. He comes in at 70 points with a fairly standard stat line of movement 6 inches, toughness 4, a 3+ save, 4 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 1. This is a standard enough profile, and for 70 points it's nothing standout. In terms of ranged weapons, he has his bolt pistol and his smite. His bolt pistol is one attack that hits on 3s at 12-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. Fairly whatever, though I guess useful enough when you're in combat. Then he has Smite, of course, which is a psychic attack. That's D6 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range, strength 5, AP 1, and damage D3. Very good at killing Space Marines. And he can overcharge that to make it the focused version, which gives it devastating wounds, but also hazardous, which it then gains strength 6, AP 2, and damage D3. A solid enough upgrade, especially against things where you'll get an extra +1 to wound, like, say, Terminators, or Gravis, or even Guardsmen to an extent, as you'll be winning them on 2s instead of 3s. Then he, of course, has the standard force weapon that the Psychers have, which is a psychic weapon. 4 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 6, AP 1, and damage D3. Nothing standout, though, good at killing medium to light infantry. He, of course, has infiltrators like all the Phobos Marines do. Then his main ability is the Shrouding Magic. While leading a unit, this unit cannot be selected as the target of a ranged attack outside of 12 inches, and they gain the Stealth ability. This is super useful, not only because it means they have lone operative, but also if someone does get in range of them, they have -1 to hit, which makes them much, more durability is always a good thing, especially on standard Marine bodies. Then he also has a Psychic Hood. While this model is leading a unit, they have a 4+ field up painting and psychic attacks, fairly niche but powerful when it comes up, though these guys won't have to deal with too much damage unless they are way out of position, which should be pretty hard to do. So the Phobos Librarian, I'd say, is actually a lot better than the standard Librarian, as while the Librarian gives them a 4+ invulnerable save, this guy just means they flat out can't be shot from most of the board's positions. Whether they're lurking in the backfield or on the flanks of the army in general, they'll always have a good amount of protection. And even if things do get in close, they of course have that last-ditch stealth to rely on. In terms of who to lead, I'd say infiltrators are the most standard if they're sitting in the backfield, as that will deny deep strike, meaning they are practically unkillable unless they can get into your deployment zone. And even if they do, it'll often be quite a depleted unit, which is the kind of unit that these guys are good at taking down. Though if you want to use them for utility, I'd actually recommend eliminators, as eliminators allow them to double move, which means they'll be moving at 12 inches a turn, and if they can get assault, like in Gladius Strike Force, they can of course move even faster than that. While these are rather pricey units at 170 points about for both of them, they're super valuable for the objective game, and in that way I think they do have a solid niche in the army. While not every army is going to take them, in the right hands, these guys can be a real thorn in the side of the enemy, taking out units that are below their weight class, but still with no retaliation available. It can be rather frustrating. Overall, I'd say that this guy is a very solid choice if you want to have a very secure home field objective, or if you just want someone roaming the mid-board that will often be unable to be shot and can really just pick its fights and punch down. I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Space Marine Lieutenants act as the second-in-command to captains, and when they wear their Vanguard Phobos armor, they do all of that, but they do it extra sneaky-like. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and welcome to another video where today we are covering the Phobos Lieutenant in Phobos Lieutenant. I suppose that sums it up pretty well. Lieutenant in Phobos armor is its full name, though I will be calling him the Phobos Lieutenant from here on out. So, the Phobos Lieutenant comes in at a rock-bottom price of 55 points. He has the standard Space Marine stat line for a light character, movement 6 inches, toughness 4, save 3+, 4 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 1. This is standard enough, though at 55 points, that's a pretty good deal. He comes with a bolt pistol and master-crafted scoped bolt carbine. The bolt pistol is 1 attack, hits on 2s at 12-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, damage 1. The master-crafted bolt carbine is 2 attacks, a hit on 2s at 24-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 2. The low AP is a bit of a problem, but there is still the good, solid enough chance that you could kill a Space Marine. Then in terms of melee weapons, he has his paired blades, much like the Incursors. He has sustained hits 1 with 5 attacks, a hit on 2s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. This is pretty much just good for killing light infantry, though it's not necessarily the worst profile in the world to take on buffs, especially those that affect AP. Then, in terms of core abilities, he has Infiltrator's Deep Strike Scout 6 inches, as well as Tactical Precision, so while leading a unit, the weapons in that unit gain lethal hit, standard Lieutenant buff, but very impactful for the Phobos units as they tend to be quite low damage. Then he has Fire and Fade. After this model's unit has fired, they can move D6 inches in the shooting phase. This has some very interesting tech alongside some of his leader options. So going over his stats one more time, he has the standard Space Marine stat line, though at a slight bargain. He is one of the cheapest characters in the Codex. I think only cheaper than him is the Blade Guard Ancient. His ranged damage is fairly so-so. His melee damage is good against light infantry, and with just a little bit of buffs, he can be really good against medium infantry as well. Then, in terms of abilities, with Infiltrators, Deep Strike, and Scouts, he can lead all of the Phobos units with no restrictions. And then, of course, Lethal Hits is always strong, and Fire and Fade allows, as I mentioned, for a very interesting ability alongside the Reavers, who this is really the main way to make Reavers a somewhat efficient unit. And speaking of, we're going to now cover his leader options. So, Incursors have fine melee damage, and their buffing rule is always solid to give your army +1 to hit. However, I'd say that if you're bringing them, it's probably better to just bring them as Reavers. We'll get to that in a second, though. The Incursors are, of course, a fine option, though, just to get some presence on the mid-board. I'd say infiltrators don't really have a reason to take this guy, as the infiltrators, despite their name, don't really want to infiltrate and generally want to sit on your home field objective, protecting it from deep strikers. Bring a Phobos Librarian for them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Reavers are, I'd say, the best option for this guy to lead, which isn't saying that much, but I think in the right hands this could be a very devastating combo. So the reason that this is so devastating is his normal move happens in the shooting phase, and obviously if you deep strike, as the Reavers do have deep strike with their grav shoots, obviously this guy has a huge benefit. You just pop off a shot at any enemy target, and then you move d6 inches towards whatever you want to charge, and then charge. However, there are some issues, mainly the low AP of this strat. That's why I recommend mainly using it in places like Gladius Task Force, where they can get extra AP for just an extra CP, which is really not too bad, especially if you're bringing someone who generates CP, whether it be Azrael, and I believe Marnius Calgar does as well. So out of the three, as I mentioned, I think Infiltrators are pretty pointless to bring this guy with. Incursors are a fine option if you want to use Scouts, though if you really want some interesting tech that could seriously catch people off guard, bring the Reavers. As I mentioned, deep strike within 9 inches, fire off a couple shots, and then they can move up to 6 inches right towards an enemy that they want to get, probably the backfield objective camper, and then charge them. With this guy and 1 CP, you are on odds on to kill a squad of 5 Space Marines, which is of course very useful to then swipe the objective out from behind your enemy's back and put them on the back foot immediately. In terms of detachments, and Gladius is of course the take-all-comers detachment, and of course this is a place where he shines. He really enjoys the Honor Vehement, as well as Honor the Chapter for +1 to wound and AP. The main reason is Honor Vehement brings him up to Strength 6 in Assault Doctrine, and then with +1 to wound, that means he's wounding most types of infantry on a 2+, and with the AP it does mean he does do slightly better against the likes of Space Marines. This is a very solid detachment for him, and is probably the main place I'd actually run him. And then in the Storm Siege Anvil, the Feel No Pain enhancement is solid enough. This would make them much tougher on the backfield objective they're probably going to steal, though I would say nothing is standing out from there. Then Iron Storm is similar, no specific buffs for this guy. However, having something that could swipe the backfield objective could be very solid for an army full of tanks. Firestorm, nothing to stand out, though they do have access to a +1 to wound strat. However, I don't think he's particularly standout in Firestorm, as you're probably going to be running a lot of infantry anyway. Stormlance, +1 to wound and reroll charges is solid. The AP strength enhancement is also very nice, just to make his combat a little bit better to help him deal with slightly tougher backfield campers. Vanguard, despite the fact that it is the stealthy Space Marine detachment, lacks any specific buffs for this guy. None of the enhancements are particularly interesting on him, and most of the stratagems actually favor range to melee, though of course if you're running a theme, like Fluffy Vanguard list, a unit swooping into the backfield to steal their home objective is very on theme, and I don't think he would be bad there. I think he would be solid in all of these, by the way. Then in the First Company Task Force, if you give him the Fear-Made Manifest, you can have an interesting tech where you obviously group up with the Reavers, charge into something, they take Battle Shock, then they take D3 Mortal Wounds if they fail it. A slightly cheesy strat, but does have some use in making sure they clear off that backfield objective. So as I've already covered in a sort of recap, we're going to cover a best use scenario. The Phobos Lieutenant is dirt cheap. 55 points is very, very cheap for the buffs he gives to his units, and most of the units he leads are pretty cheap. With Reavers, it would be 145 points, if I'm not mistaken, which is very cheap for something that has the risk to steal a backfield objective. Now, this will not be totally universal, but his damage is, again, solid enough to take a 5-man Space Marine squad out, and of course anything lighter is really not going to want to get in melee with these guys, as they're quite savage against low toughness enemies. However, they could struggle against something like Custodes holding their backfield if they're not running Sisters of Silence, like I don't. But then they could also just go jump into a table quarter for Engage on All Fronts or something along those lines. Overall, I'd say that he is a very useful unit, but you do need to have a plan to use him and make sure you actually know what he can take on. Because if you charge this guy into something he's going to bounce off of, you're just going to lose 150 points of your army. But if you know what fights to take and which parts of the board are the most important part to take, having a unit that has an almost guaranteed deep strike charge is extremely useful, especially against armies that are elite but quite fragile, like something like Sisters, as these guys would rip a Sister squad apart with very little problems, especially in Gladius with the extra AP and +1 to wound. They would be ripping them apart. Though, of course, these guys aren't really going to be taking down any tanks or anything, so if you are bringing them, this is a given, but make sure you have ample firepower before you include these guys, because if these guys take the backfield objective and then a Lehman Rush just turns around and blows them up, there's not much use in that. Make sure to Alpha Strike hard, and these guys can help you wrap up the game. I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and tell me what you thought of this slightly longer form down below in the comments. See you all next time for some Space Marine 2 content. Phobos Marines, of course, act as the vanguard forces of the Space Marines. They often take cover under night and like to perform stealth operations. They do, of course, need captains to lead them, and captains that are proficient in this often wear their Phobos armor continuously, becoming Phobos Captains. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Phobos Captain, one of which is starring in Space Marine 2 as Captain Acheran. Anyways, the Phobos Captain comes in at 80 points with a fairly standard profile of movement 6 inches, toughness 4, a 3+ save, a 4+ invulnerable save, 5 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 1. This is a solid enough character stat line for 80 points. In terms of ranged weapons, he has a bolt pistol, as is to be expected, which is one attack that hits on 2s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1 at 12-inch range. Then the Instigator Bolt Carbine is precision at 24-inch range with one attack that hits on 2s at strength 4, AP 2, and damage 2, which is a solid gun to blow up a Space Marine. Then in melee is where things start to get a little questionable. He has a Combat Blade, which has 6 attacks that hit on 2s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. This isn't really useful for much except punching down against lightly armored and low toughness enemies, things like guardsmen or I suppose certain Eldar. Then in terms of abilities, he of course has Leader as well as Infiltrate, and then he has Stealth as well. Rites of War is his captain ability, which is once per battle round. You can target this unit with a stratagem and reduce the cost of it by 1 CP, which is a solid ability, though maybe not the most impactful on a guy who can only lead Phobos units. Master of Deceit is his main ability and what you're mainly paying the points for, and this is after both armies are deployed, but before the first battle round is decided, so deciding who goes first. You get to select up to 3 Astartes infantry units, and then you can redeploy them, or, if you so choose, you can put them into Strategic Reserve, regardless of how many units are already in Strategic Reserve. Now, this is something that will generally benefit more skilled players, more so than sort of a beer and pretzels kind of player, like most people are. This is going to be something that's useful when it comes to deployment, where a lot of people do say the game is decided in the deployment phase. And this, of course, allows you to play more games in that area. It can be used to bait things, it can be used to chase after something that thought it might be safe, or otherwise. This is in general a very strong ability, and for only 80 points, it's really not too bad of a price to pay to include it in your army. Now, he is a leader character, so he generally will want a bodyguard, though I don't think he really needs one, as he's mainly here just for his redeploy. In terms of an Eliminator squad, they're always solid as they can move quite quickly, and also offer some sniper fire, which this guy also adds a little bit to with his precision bolt, infiltrator, his bolt carbine. I can't remember the first name of it. Then Incursors, he doesn't have much value with because Incursors rely on their scout move, and he has no scouts, so he's kind of a dead option there. And then again with Reavers, this guy doesn't have Deep Strike, which means he's getting rid of the Reaver's only positive attribute. Don't run this guy with Reavers. And then, weirdly enough, I think Scouts might actually be his best option as a leader unit. They're the cheapest unit he can lead. They have, the keywords necessary to work with this guy. He's not really holding them back. And if you want to buy in the Infiltrator, or the Redeploy, and you want to keep this guy somewhat safe on a backfield, 65 points for some pretty tough bodies is really hard to go wrong with. So including this guy with some Scouts isn't really going to hurt your points cost, or your army, as this will help open up some extra opportunities for deployment. Though, as I mentioned earlier, if you just want this guy to cower behind a building all game that can maybe do some secondaries like deploying teleport homers or similar, I don't think that's a bad option, as you're mainly just buying him for his redeploys, but that does have its restrictions, as we'll cover in the best use section. Before we cover that, though, we are going to cover the various detachments available to the core Space Marines. Gladius is, I've said this song and dance a million times, it's take all comers. Devastator Doctrine, is always good, as you always generally want him to be on the move, and him being able to use free runaway is good, as his unit will usually be quite fragile. And then in terms of Anvil, there is at least something to be said here with Infiltrators. They have a battle drill recall, which gives you 5+ sustained hits if you stand still, and you'd be at +1 to wound, which would make them actually a pretty nasty sniping threat, and you could do it for free. Though that may be a slightly more niche use, maybe not something to build around, but if the opportunity presents itself, these guys could blow up a character pretty efficiently, especially one that's toughness 4 or lower. And then in terms of Firestorm, Assault always pairs well with fast-moving utility options, and Eliminators specifically. They appreciate being able to move and get better positions, along with their free move after they shoot. In terms of Stormlance, more speed is generally a good thing. However, it doesn't pair super well with this guy, but it could be useful if you're running some foot-slogging infantry units, something like, say, Terminators or Blade Guard Veterans, and you place them in a situation where you want to bait something out and then you want to redeploy them somewhere else. It's also faster for them to get to melee, while also maybe keeping them a little bit more safe, though there's nothing specifically there for him that is super useful, as he's not a melee beast or anything. In Vanguard, I don't think he's outstanding or anything, but he's about as solid there as he can be. And you could give him the Ghost Weave Cloak if you don't want to buy him a unit to lead, as that keeps him safe and would allow him to camp in the backfield, and would also keep the redeploys pretty cheap. And then the First Company Task Force, there's not much of a reason to bring this guy. He doesn't really have much synergy there, and in general, First Company Task Force isn't super useful, though if you're running a big unit of Terminators, he could be useful for redeployment, which is one of the ways to run that detachment if you wanted to, but on his own, there's really not much synergy there. So as we've obviously been talking about, the main thing you're buying with this, guys, is the redeploys. Just running him on his own, I think, is fine. Only 80 points really isn't super expensive for the ability to play games and deployment, which is always super useful, though it is army-specific. Part of like what I mentioned with the Iron Storm, it's not super useful with Iron Storm because they're vehicles, you can't redeploy them, and they're usually not going to be going for big infantry death units. But if you are running infantry units that might have to foot slog, this guy's honestly a pretty solid choice. For example, you place them in a position so your enemy, who's saying, let's just say guard, places their Lehman Russ Executioner right in their line of fire, so obviously they would get lit up immediately. This guy can put them in a place where their flank is maybe unguarded, or something along those lines. It is a common saying that the game is won in deployment before the game even begins. And this guy lets you play games in that deployment phase. And honestly, I think his main weakness is that he's a leader unit. So he generally does want to lead someone just to keep him safe, as while his stats aren't bad for a character, he generally wants someone to keep him safe. But as I mentioned, I don't think any of his squads synergize super well. If you want him to be leading something, just bring scouts. Dead simple. I think that infiltrators are much better with the Librarian, and honestly the same with the Eliminators. And Reavers are 100% better with the Lieutenant, and then Incursors don't pair really well with any of them because I don't think any of them have scouts. But this guy is nice insurance and allows you to, as I mentioned, bait deployment for things that would chew up your infantry very quickly. It's something Space Marines often faces. Their Space Marines are tough, but not to the certain weapons. So if you can bait those weapons, like a giant plasma cannon or auto cannon, to deploy on one side of the board, and then you just scoop up your dangerous infantry and plop them down elsewhere, that is a valuable thing. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.